That we have for Achilazon. Three things. Gufo dom l'yam, Briyoso dom l'dag, and Techelet echad l'shivim shana. This is a very cryptic statement. It is very, very hard to know what that means. So let's try to do our best. Ole echad l'shivim shana. Rashi speaks out, the other Mefarshim speak out that it's in the sea, and once out of every 70 years it comes up from the sea onto the dry land. Now, what's that? Why is that important? So that's when they would collect it, the pashtas, right? That's when they go ahead and there would be a mass gathering of it, and that's where the brisa ends, the fikach dam of yakarim, because it only comes up once every 70 years. That's rare. That's very rare, and therefore it's very expensive. But we'll see. Maybe that's not so simple. Now, briyaso dam l'dag implies that it looks like a fish. Somehow, it's aquatic. If it's simply, right, let's start simple. If briyaso dam l'dag, it looks like it's a fish. Now, what's gufo dam l'yam? What's that mean? So, the only way I would know how to understand that is that it looks. You can't talk about its physical appearance that we already saw as briyaso dam l'dag. Its structure is like a fish. So I assume gufo dam l'yam is talking about its color. So now, its color is like the yam. Now, what color is the yam? So I would have two ways to approach that. I think there are two legitimate ways to approach that question. Number one, you could say, what color is water? Blue. So chilazon has to be blue. That'd be one way that the Bryce is teaching me. Or no, the yam maybe is not referring to the water. Maybe it's referring to the seabed. The seabed is what color?
Gray.
Gray, brown, right? It's dirt. It's sand. So maybe the chilazon is that color. I think those are two legitimate ways to look at the brisa. I want to show you another brisa. The brisa is a menachos, daf mem gimel amud beis. This brisa came up 10 lines before the brisa which you just read. The brisa says as follows. Tanya is talking to brisa. Meir said, "Man ishtanat techelet michol minei tzivainim." Why is techelet different from all the different colors that there are? So, Techelet is comparable to the sea. The yam the yam is comparable to the heavens. The kisei hakavod. The rekia, the heavens, are comparable to the throne of God, whatever that means. Shene'amar, like it says, v'tachas ragla kamasa livnas hasapir, under the legs of Hashem was like a sapphire, bricks, u'ka'etzam hashamayim l'toyar, and like the heavens in purity. Uksiv kamara even sapir d'mus kisei. And it also is written like the appearance of a sapphire is the image of the throne of Hashem. What color is a sapphire? And what color is the heavens? Blue. And that's being compared to what? The Techelet. That's being compared to the yam. 10 lines later, there's something called the yam. The whole point of Tzivoni, of the Tzeva, is talking about the yam. The yam is clear, and the Brisa and Gimel is talking about blue. Now, the Brisa goes along 10 lines later in the Gemara and says, "Gufo dam l'yam." It would maybe there's machlokas in the Brisas, could be, and the Brisa on Mem Dalet is talking about brown, like the sand, and the Brisa Mem Gimel is talking about blue, and the two disconnected terminologies. Theoretically, someone can make such an argument. If I'm learning of the Gemara, I want to know what Chazal are teaching me. So now, how would I approach this Gemara? Gufo dam l'yam obviously means it's blue. Obviously. What, the Gemara changed what its definition of yam is in 10 lines? So it's the presentation of the Gemara, even if the authors of the Brisa disagreed, the presentation of the Gemara certainly does not imply whatsoever that there's a change in meaning. It's a very hard statement to make. Now, comes along the Rambam. The Rambam is in Hilchos Tzitzis. The Rambam says, "Keitzad seven tcheles." Shel tzitzis. How do you go ahead and dye a garment of tcheles? Look chinat semer. You take wool, the shonos of the seed. You put it in some kind of mixture. V'charkach mechamsin asay. Afterwards, you launder it. Achi naki until it's clean. Masichin asel ba'ohala. Then you go ahead, you boil it up. You put in some chemicals, and so that it absorbs the dye. Right? ואחר כך מביאים דם חילזון. Afterwards you bring the blood of the חילזון. והוא דג שדומה אינו לעין התחילס. And it's a dog, it's a fish that its ayin. Its ayin is comparable to the ayin of Techelet. It's a very interesting thing. What's an ayin mean? Right? So I brought for you here the Gemara in Shabbos. The Gemara says, Ein nosin onin shel pishton the techatonor. You can't put tongues of flax into the oven, ela kadeshi avilum yavadiyun, until they toast during the day. V'los etzem l'yura ela kadeshi yiklut ha'ayin. And you're only allowed to put wool inside a dye before Shabbos, to the extent that when Shabbos comes, it already absorbed the color, it absorbed the dye. So ayin is a way that when we're talking about the color, the essence of an item, the palette of whatever is being discussed, the term Chazal uses is called the ayin. Comes along the Rambam, Hudag shadume eino le'ena tcheles. The fish is the same color as tcheles. It seems explicit that the Rambam is saying that the color of the chilazon itself is blue. The same ink that it's producing is the color of the fish itself. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen a Mirux trunculus. We've seen them, if the person comes, Mark Sturman comes in, he'll give you a presentation. The Mirux trunculus is not blue. He's brown. He looks like the seabed. I'll tell you that Yam is the seabed. If I'm learning up the sugya, before I get to archaeology is a whole different discussion. If I'm looking at what Chazal taught me, a chilazon is, look what the Rambam, the Rishonim tell me a chilazon is, I would assume, is blue. That would be the basic approach. So number one, if we're discussing the color of the chilazon, it seems to me, from the basic understanding of the sugya menachos, from the Rambam himself, it seems like we're talking about a blue fish. How? Let's talk about the process of dyeing. Let's go to number 7 already. So now, the process of dyeing, the Gemara says as follows. In source number 7, how do you dye? How do you make this? Right? You have the fish, you have a chilazon, whatever this guy is. How do you go ahead and make a dye out of it? How do you change the color? Ma'isinin dam chilazon, you bring the blood of a chilazon, and you bring chemicals. You throw it into a pot, we boil it up, you take a little bit of an egg, you make sure it's the right color. You go ahead and throw on the semer, you throw on the garment that you're dyeing. So now, according to the Braisa, what do you have? What do you use to make the dye? So he says, Ma'isinan dam chilazon. The Gemara says you bring the blood of a chilazon. The Rambam that we brought before earlier in Hilchos Tzitzis said, what do? You bring the achakach mevim dam chilazon. You bring the blood of a chilazon. So it's very clear, both from the language of the Gemara and the Rambam, that what's used in order to make the dye is the blood of a chilazon. I've seen a presentation from Techelet multiple times. What they do in order to make a dye from the Mirux trunculus, they take the snail, they take a gland off the stomach of the snail, and they cut off the gland, they dry off the gland, they turn it into a powder, and they boil it up. They don't take out the blood. They take a gland, they take a body part. So now, maybe that means dam is a body part. Maybe dam's a body part, and dam's lav dafka. It doesn't really mean that. I asked this question of Hershel Schechter, the last time he was here. Hershel Schechter said, from the Rambam, you're right, but Tosfos says that you can, dam is lav dafka, and it come from anywhere. I looked, I'm not familiar with such a Tosfos. I'm sure that he's more familiar, Shas and Tosfos than I am. It's not a proof, I'm not questioning it. He said there's such a Tosfos. I'm not familiar with the Tosfos. I found a different Tosfos. Tosfos in Ksubas says, I brought for you in source 8, V'omer Rabbeinu Tam, Ki dam chilazon sheseven bo mifkid pakid. The Gemara here is discussing the ability to have to consummate a marriage on Shabbos. And the problem of consummating a marriage on Shabbos is that it might cause a woman to bleed. Are you allowed to do that? What's the issue of causing a woman to bleed, etc.? It's a discussion not for now. And in that discussion, the context of causing someone to bleed, so comes the law of Rabbeinu Tam. It says, Dam chilazon shetzilvim bo, the dam of a chilazon that we dye things with, nifkat pakid. It's deposited inside of the chilazon, and therefore, eino chai mishum netilas neshama. If you were to make it bleed on Shabbos to take out the dye, you wouldn't be liable for netilas neshama. It would be something different. It seems pretty clear from this Tosfos that dam means dam. The comparison to consummation of a marriage and the prohibition that might ensue because you cause a woman to bleed is being compared to the status of the blood that we use to dye chilazon with. So what are you going to tell me, Rabbi? There's no animal that has blue blood. What are you talking about? Is that true? There's something called a horseshoe crab. Science found that there are a lot of benefits, medicinal benefits to horseshoe crabs. The blood of a horseshoe crab. If you take a little blood out of a horseshoe crab, you know what color it is?
Blue.
Bright blue. A bright blue. Now I'm not saying a horseshoe crab is the chilazon. What I'm trying to prove to you is that there are things in nature that have blue blood. And so if I have here a Braisa, I have here a Rambam, I have here a Tosfos, even if you want to say that the Braisa and the Rambam are lav davka, this Tosfos at least, it's not lav davka, this Tosfos is clear, it's talking about the dam, is what's being used, it's being harvested from the chilazon. So then it's hard for me to say, it would be hard for me to understand how that could be used as gland. You could use a gland in order to produce the same thing. That would be a jump for me, but could someone say it's lav davka? Someone could say it's lav davka, and it's not like Tosfos. Fine. Now, that's one issue. A separate issue is as follows. In the process of how it says you make them, it's very clear, right? You bring blood, you take chemicals, you throw it into a pot, you boil it up, Techelet. So, how did Techelet come about? So this person, Baruch Sturman, he put decades of research in. He followed this process. He found snails. He tried different snails. He tried different trying processes. Every single time he took the Mir's trunculus and he tried to make a dye out of it. You know what color it came? It became purple. Purple. And he couldn't figure out why. Until finally he was about to give up. And when he tells the story, it's very dramatic. He said, you know what, I'm trying it one more time. His wife's like, over my dead body. It smells horrible. If you ever smelled it, it's mamish. It reeks when you make this stuff. It smells horrible, not in my house. So he said, fine, I'll go outside. His wife kicked him out of the house. His last experiment, he's drying it. Blue. It turned blue. Now why did it turn blue? Very simple. Because when the chemical compound of the snail combined with the chemicals was exposed to UV light, that UV light changed the chemical development of the dye and turned a purple into a blue. So, I would ask you, if I'm writing a recipe for how to go ahead and make Techelet, would that be a necessary component to say that it has to be done outside? So, if Aryeh Leibowitz, I heard give a shiur about this once, if Aryeh Leibowitz wanted to claim that when the Rambam writes that the simamonin, that you put chemicals in, he also was referring to the fact that it was exposed to UV light. Okay. I'm saying if we're trying to write a process of how to do it, so then the Bryce and the Rambam did a very bad job, right? Because Baruch Sturman's the proof for that, right? Baruch Sturman did this for decades, and he didn't know that from reading the Rambam, from reading the Brysa. Number two, so he also wanted to claim that, and obviously, because he didn't even have to write it out, even if not, he didn't have to write it out because it smells so bad. Again, they use the anecdotal, but Baruch Sturman didn't realize that, right? He was doing it inside his house. His wife finally kicked him out, and that's how he was exposed to it. So the fact that there's necessary parts of the process that without that you cannot achieve a blue dye, it was done inside, you don't have a blue dye, is a big question mark in my book. Now, is this a refutation? No, again, it's not a refutation. It's like it. I give out Tama, no? It's not a refutation, but it's a question mark. How are you supposed to relate to that? Now, is the chilazon a snail? Yeah? We're assuming there's an assumption being made that the chilazon is a snail. Which snail is it? And the trunculus is a different snail. I want to add a new question. Is the chilazon a snail? So now, there's a person who wrote an article called Techelet that was written by a person named Orayta. In that article, he wants to prove that the chilazon is a snail. I'm going to show you momentarily how he wants to prove it. But first, I'll show you seemingly what seems to be a very strong proof to support the fact that it's a snail. The Shiur Rabbah, which is part of the Midrash Rabbah, writes as follows: Amar leitzeu loman min chilazon. Go and learn from a chilazon. What's a chilazon? Shekol zman shu gadol. The whole time the chilazon is growing, nartiko gadol imo. Its bag grows with him. Now, what's it mean, a bag? What animal grows in a bag? So, I could hear a very, very straightforward interpretation being that he has a shell. And the bag, which he's encapsulated within, grows as long as the animal is growing. Right? It's a very normal thing to happen. And that's called that they grow together. So that would support the fact that it's a snail. Beautiful. A Midrash Rabbah. Now, Moisei Navon brings this Midrash Rabbah, and then he wants to buttress this support. He wants to support it with the Gemara. The Gemara in Masechah Shabbos, in source number 10, says, Tanu Rabbanan atzad chilazon v'hapotzo. A person who traps a chilazon and punctures it. Now, we're talking about different isurim that you can do on Shabbos. So one isur is trapping it. The other, we're going to get to that. Whether it's relevant to isur of trapping when it comes to Dimir Shonkilis. But there's a different issue of potso. So what's it mean potso? So Moisei Navon wanted to claim that what's potso mean? Potso means you crack it. You crack it. Now what do you crack? You can only crack something that has a shell. Right? So if it doesn't have a shell, you can't use the language of Tzia. It's not accurate. That was his claim. And he wants to prove from this Braisa, again, that not just in the Midrash Rabbah, but even in the Talmud Bavli, it's clear that the chilazon is a snail. So I just brought a few different questions that I have on the veracity of making such a claim. Number one, I brought a few different Gemara on Shabbos, a Braisa. The Braisa says, if I crush olives, if my hands are tamei, right? My hands are wet, so then they become muksha to kabel ktuma. Now, last I checked, olives don't have shells, right? But puncturing the flesh of an olive is called tzia, according to Chazal. So that'd be one question I would have. You see here that the language of being pitzei is not something which necessarily has to demonstrate that there's a shell. But fine, let's keep going. There's a braisa. This is a mishnah. A potzer shnei chutin. Someone who cuts two strings. Right? You have one long piece of string. This is one of the lamites malachos. You have a string which is too long. You cut it into two. That's called hapotzer shnei chutin. Cutting a string in half is called a p'tzia. Does that have anything to do with the shell? It's very hard to imagine. Orayta. And I bring for you a pasuk. This is astonishing. When you talk about damages, a chayvul, odem ba'odem, a person damages someone else, what do you have to pay, right? This is one of the most famous psukim that we like discussing in Orayta. Kfiyah tachas piyah, petza tachas petza, chabura tachas chabura. What's a wound for a wound, right? Eye for an eye. Right? Eye for eye means money, it means you're going to knock his eye out. The secret, right, of the 12, whatever. Yeah, famous things that we talk about in Orayta. But what's petza tachas petza? A wound for a wound. It's talking about damaging a human being. The human being has a shell. So it's very, very clear that the word p'tzia in Chazal, in the Chumash, is taking flesh and puncturing it. The flesh of an olive, even the physical structure of a piece of string. But you rupture that string, that's called a p'tzia. It has nothing to do with a shell. So the fact that there's a proof from the Shiur Rabbah, I'm not taking away from that. The fact that the language of p'tzia is used, so then that I want to refute that proof wholeheartedly. So now we have a Midrash Rabbah in Shiur that seems to denote that what we're talking about a chilazon is a snail. I want to show you different sources now that discuss what's the essence, what is a chilazon. Yeah. So I brought from here a Ravid. The Ravid is in the introduction to the Sefer Yetzirah. The Ravid, besides writing a commentary on the Mishnah Torah, actually wrote a commentary on the Sefer Yetzirah as well. And he writes as follows: Chilazon, yefshar lamod olav. Chilazon, it's hard to know what it is. If it's a fish, maybe it's a plant. It's alive and it moves. Eino machlif nekoimai. He doesn't move locations. Ki hu nodes v'tekua ba'aretz, because he's stuck into the ground. So if you can ask me what this sounds like, it sounds to me like it's coral, some kind of a coral, right? It's a coral. It's alive, it's not alive, it's stuck in the ground, it moves, but it doesn't change location. It sounds to me like it's like some kind of a coral. Now, could I hear that someone's going to say, no, it's a snail, and it needs to cool in the karka because the snail can move a little bit, but he can't walk and he doesn't change location. I could hear such a thing. But, from before we get to archaeology that's dictating how we learn the sources, let's look at the source. It sounds to me like it's a coral. It's somewhere between a tzemeach and a chai. I want to show for you now a Nudei Yehuda. Nudei Yehuda is talking about tefillin. Are you allowed to make dye out of tefillin, out of something which is also to eat, forbidden to eat? And from that, he starts talking about techelet, because techelet is a dye, and it comes from this thing called a chilazon. And if this chilazon is something which is mutter to eat, and it can only be something which is mutter to eat, so then obviously you could use a dye for your tefillin, which is also, you have to use something which is mutter to eat. But if I can dye my techelet with something which is not mutter to eat, then what's the difference between techelet and tefillin? My tefillin, then I can also dye with something which is not mutter to eat. So because of this question, he has a practical what to do. So he first off, you guys who know who's the Nudei Yehuda? You know who the Nudei Yehuda is? What? The Nudei Yehuda was named Chizkel Lando.
My great-great-grandpa.
JJ, that's Chashav Yichus. He was born in the year 1713. He lived for 80 years, which back in the day is a very long time. He passed away in 1793. He wrote Responsa. He wrote a commentary on Shas. He was like massive. So he writes here, he quotes Rashi in multiple places in Shas that says that the chilazon is a worm. It's a worm, a talas. A talas is a worm. So, number one, he starts off saying from there that if it's a worm, according to Rashi, then that's something which is also to eat, and then my tefillin are fine. Then he goes along and says, but you know what, maybe it's not a worm, because from the Rambam says, well, we saw the Rambam before, the Rambam says, Behu dag, it's a fish. That what? The color of the fish is comparable to the color of techelet. So it comes along, the Nudei Yehuda says, you know what, if it's a fish, so then maybe it's a fish that's actually tahor. Maybe it has fins and scales, and if that's the truth, so then maybe our tefillin also has to have, be made from something which is kosher. But then he's upset because Rashi says, we saw this before also, that it's ola achas mishidim shana. It goes up 170 years, and if it goes up 170 years, says the Nudei Yehuda, there's no fish in the world that goes up 170 years. And he says, so what is it? It's a crawler. It's a creepy crawler. It's something that crawls on the ground. And then he says, you know what? I can prove it to you. Because what's the Brisa say? Let's make a quick, let's reference back to source number 1, the original Brisa. The Brisa says, Briaso doma ledag. Says the Nudei Yehuda, if it's Briaso doma ledag, if its structure appears like a dog, why did it say it appears like a dog? Briaso is a dog. It's a fish. The fact that he says doma ledag implies that it's something which is not a fish, but appears like a fish. So comes along the Nudei Yehuda and says, you know what? So maybe it's a third category. And then he's like, I don't know. Rashi says it's a worm. The Rambam says it's a fish. The Rambam also says it's a fish that grows in Yam HaMelech. It grows in the Dead Sea. We're going to have to talk about that later also. Right? The Yitzchak sense of the Yam HaMelech is the Dead Sea. Maybe it doesn't mean the Dead Sea. Right? But so there's such ambiguity and unclarity in what this is that the one thing that he didn't propose that it was a snail. Which is interestingly enough. A worm, yes. A kosher fish with snails, scales, and fins, yes. Anything else? Not yet. Now, could someone claim that when Rashi says it's a worm, he means a worm inside of a shell, and a worm inside of a shell is otherwise known as a snail? Maybe. Why would Rashi use such imprecise lashon? I don't know, but maybe. I'm open-minded. Now, how common is this chilazon? How common is it? So, we saw already the Brisa in Menachos says it comes up once every 70 years. But there's a Rashi here in Shabbos that you have to see. There was something called Tzaddik Chilazon. right? The people who trap chilazon. Now, if something comes up once every 70 years, is that a good parnasa to make? If I want to be a professional chilazon trapper, is that a good way to make a parnasa? That's an awful idea. It means that once a lifetime I can trap these things. This is an awful profession. Guys, I'm not a business major, but if I'm going to give you advice for the future, do not choose a profession that you can only do once every 70 years. Obviously, right? It's a bad profession. So, number one, the fact that there's something called trappers of chilazon implies, we're going to take questions soon. The fact that there's something called trappers of chilazon implies that there were once every 70 years is imprecise, right? That's number one. Now, number two is when the Rambam discussed the chilazon, he never mentioned this condition of once every 70 years. Why not? So I would assume that maybe this is why. The Rambam understood there's something throughout Talmud Bavli that it's expressed in different ways, tzaddik chilazon and yogvim and all these different terminology that Chazal have on people who trapped these chilazons. It's hard to imagine that it happened once every 70 years. So if that's the case, it makes sense why the Rambam omitted this detail from his description of what the chilazon is. So the fact that we readily find the Mirux trunculus on the shores of Greece in mass numbers, as they collect them nowadays, so then it makes a lot of sense. Adarabah, there's trappers. And when did they come up? Once every 70 years. Maybe that was a mass migration, and maybe this, and maybe that. Fine. Rashi, when he's talking here in Masechah Shabbos, says, Tzaddik chilazon, litzvoa tcheles bedamo. They, right? Again, he uses this language. They color, they dye the tcheles with its blood. Vu kemin dag katan, it's like a little fish. And he comes up once every 70 years. Rashi learned that this was precise. Even though the Rambam omitted it, it's already a machlokes rishonim. Whether this halacha, this detail of once every 70 years is true or not. That's number one. Number two, comes along the Radvaz. And from here, I want to go ahead and I want to answer how even if you learn like Rashi, maybe it could still explain the Mirux trunculus. The Mirux trunculus, right, is ready and available. So says the Radvaz. The Radvaz says, you know what? Really? The chilazon is always available. If you go into the sea, you know what you're looking for, you can find it. Achas l'shivim shana, it came up, and they were readily available on the shores. So you didn't even have to hunt them, you didn't have to go find them. You could go ahead, take your bucket on the shores, bring it in. Who are the tzayadei chilazon? Those are the people that, within the 70-year span, where they're not coming, so how do I have my fresh supply of tcheles? I have trappers. Those trappers can go ahead and get them. If that's the case, so that explains Rashi. That Rashi can understand that even like Rashi, the Mirux trunculus could be the chilazon, and the achas hashivim shana. So, first of all, he says we don't have that anymore. Why? We don't have that anymore once we were kicked out of Eretz Yisrael. So, depending on your philosophical beliefs, if this is the beginning of the Geula, it's not beginning of Geula, maybe we should have the Achas L'Shivim Shana, maybe we shouldn't have the Achas L'Shivim Shana. I could hear different stances being taken there. But we don't have it anymore. Fine. What's interesting is that the Ravid's push to say this is because he specifically is trying to avoid the fact that there was something miraculous that happened. He's coming to avoid this because in the Midbar, part of building the Mishkan necessitated something called the skins of a tachash. A tachash was an animal which had many different colors on its wool. And that was used to build parts of the Mishkan. So he's bothered, where did they get the chelas from? So he said that they went to the Yam Suf to go ahead and collect it. Not the Mediterranean, they went to Yam Suf to collect the Mirux trunculus. And therefore it was something which was natural. It doesn't have to be something which is miraculous. Now, I will tell you, this I've spoken to multiple people about, who have put a lot of energy into this sugya. The Mirux trunculus, for it to go ahead and come out of the sea and go into the land, is something which would have to be miraculous. These things can't move. They move because of the push of the water. So, we'll see this. With this in the next stage, but they have to travel land, and they have to travel a distance of land in order for them to be in the area of Zvulun. And therefore, in order, it could be that it's true, we would lose the value of the Radvaz. The Radvaz was trying to say that when they went up once every 70 years, it was something which is not miraculous for them to get Mirach Trunculus, to get from the sea to the area, the portion of Zvulun in Eretz Yisrael, would need a miracle in order for that to occur. Different sources and what Chazal said. So the first thing here brought you was a Sifri. This Sifri sounds like it's out of a science fiction movie, but I'll read it for you inside because you're not going to believe me otherwise. If someone told me what the Sifri said, I would say you're crazy. I'm going to read you the words of the Sifri. It says, Kishefa Yomim Yinaku. Here it's talking about the Zvulun, that they're gonna nurse from the Shefa of the seas. Zu Yoma Shel Yafel. It's the sea of Yafel. Sheganuz the Tzadikim Lasadavai. That's stored away for the righteous in the future. Manayta the Loma Shel Kulsvir Sheiris B'Yam Agadol. Tzura Shel Kesav Ejal Zalanim Tzivis. All this boats that get lost in the Yam Agadol, they're full of silver and gold and beautiful stones and margolios and pearls. They have all these beautiful vessels inside of them. The sea is going to spit them out onto the shores of Yafo in the future. They're going to give it to the tzaddikim in the future. That's the pasuk means to say. Fine, that we can believe. Rav Yossi says, one time I was walking from a place called Ksiv to a place called Tzor. I found an old man. I asked, how's he doing? What's going on? He said, I asked him, what do you do for a living? Where'd you go? You went to Shiur, you went to Chicago, you're in business. Right? What do you do? What do you do for a living? So what did he say? He says, I make a panasa from the chilazon. He said, where do you find the chilazon? No, it's a mystery. It's a mystery animal. Where did you find him? So he says, I take an oath. I'm telling you, there's a place between mountains, and there's tons of poisonous spiders there. And if they bite you, you'll die from the poison. And there, what happened is chilazon there. And if they get attacked by the spiders, they fall apart there in the place. So he said, if that's the case, so then it must be that they're hidden for the future for tzaddikim to come. Where's this place? Where's this place? There's a place between mountains. A place between mountains, and that's where the chilazon is hidden. So now, maybe what are you going to tell me? There's mountains, but between the mountains, then there's water inside, but there's spiders. The spiders crawling around all around, and there's spiders that kill the chilazon. So it's very, very clear from the Sifri that the chilazon is terrestrial. The chal doesn't grow. It's not something which is aquatic at all, according to the Sifri. That's number one. Now, there's a Gemara here about Sanhedrin. The Gemara says as follows. This is source 20. He went up onto a mountain. He saw that on that day there was only one chilazon on the mountain. The next day, rain fell. The whole mountain was full of this chilazon. So now, what happened? There's tons of chilazon that are living on a har. Now you're right, it had to rain, but it's not aquatic, right? The Mirach Trunculus can't live on a mountain, let alone go from the sea onto a mountain and fill up a mountain one night. Right? That it can't do. So it's clear from this Gemara that it's terrestrial. So this is so bothersome. I'm going to prove to you that it's so bothersome that there's a commentary called the Yad Ramah. The Yad Ramah was a 12th century Spanish Rishon. The Yad Ramah says it must be that we're discussing a different type of chilazon than the chilazon of Menachos, because the chilazon of Menachos is in the sea. And this is clear that the animal that we're talking about in Sanhedrin is not from the sea, it's terrestrial. Rashi in Sanhedrin learns that we're talking about the chilazon, the same chilazon of Menachos, the chilazon that we're discussing in Sanhedrin. So maybe it was miraculous, maybe it was miraculous. I asked this question to Herschel Schechter last time that he was here. He didn't have an answer to this question. How does this Gemara fit with the Mirach Trunculus? I have another story for you. Here, this source is less That's the proof. The Gemara in the Second Sanhedrin Daf Yud Beis says, Rava sent to a person, Zubba Mirekes. There's a group of people coming from a city called Rekes, V'tafs Nesher. The Romans caught them. In their hands there was things that were made in luz. What's made in luz? Techelet. They made techelet in luz. Now, the Brayse in the Masechah Seita is luz sheshivim b'techelet. Luz is the place where they dye techelet. Now, Luz is a landlocked city. It's a landlocked city. So, the basic, what's the Brayse say? What's the Gemara say? The Gemara says that Luz is the place where they dye techelet. So, they dye techelet doesn't necessarily mean that's where the techelet comes from. Doesn't mean that that's where the chilazon come from. It could be that the chilazon came from somewhere else and they transported it to Luz, and Luz is where they had the manufacturing process. That could be. I'm open to that. Generally speaking, I would assume that the place where you find it is next to the place that you process it. What's the point of the transportation? So nowadays, you need more land and this and that. Maybe it's also like that back then. That the land by the sea, if it comes from the sea, is also more valuable, and therefore to have a plant somewhere else makes more sense economically. It could be. I'm open to it. But here is also a leaning towards the fact that the chilazon is actually terrestrial as opposed to something which is aquatic. I want to prove it. There's also here. We're running out of time. I don't want to get stuck in this. I brought you here the Sifri de Beirav. The Sifri de Beirav is a commentary on the Sifri. He writes as follows. He writes, number one, you can read it inside on your own. Number one, he says that once in 70 years, as literal, there is no existence of chilazon outside of the once in every 70 years. That's not like the Radvaz. The Radvaz says that they're readily chappable. They only come up once every 70 years. That was how we could have made Rashi's stance fit with the reality of the Mirch Trunculus. According to the Sifri de Beirav, there's no reality of it ascertaining, of it getting these animals, the chilazon, whatever it is, except once every 70 years. That's number one. Number two, he says they're near the Dead Sea. It has nothing to do with the Mediterranean, the Dead Sea. And number three is impossible chapter. Fine. Now like this. Let's say they're aquatic. Let's say they are aquatic. So now, are they from the Mediterranean? So, I brought for you here the Gemara in Masechah Shabbos. It says that Yugvim. What are Yugvim? Yugvim are tzayadei chilazonos, the people who chap a chilazon. And where are they from? There's some Sulama Shel Tzur Bad Haifa. Because of current events, you probably know Tzur is better than you would have known otherwise. But Tzur is in Lebanon, right? On the coast. And from the coast of Lebanon until Haifa, that's where the Yugvim hung out. So if you're going to ask me, that works great with the Mirch Trunculus, right? Why? Because the Mirch Trunculus is trapped in the Mediterranean. We're talking about the coastline of the Mediterranean. So where did the chappers used to hang out? By the Mediterranean. Beautiful. That would make a lot of sense. I brought for you here a Zohar. The Zohar writes as follows in source number 25. The Zohar writes, Techelet is from the fish of the sea, the Ginosar, in a place called Ginosar. And that's in the portion of Zvulun. Ginosar is near the Kinneret. Now that's very interesting, because if you know the Kinneret, there's different types of seas, right? There's something called saltwater seas and freshwater seas. Generally speaking, the aquatic life that is able to exist in saltwater cannot also exist in freshwater, obviously, right? The whole system has to function differently. So the Mirch Trunculus can exist in salt water. It cannot exist in fresh water. According to the Zohar, so the Mirch Trunculus, the chilazon, is actually in the Kinneret. Interesting. But there's still the Gemara. I'm not saying that. I brought for you a Rambam. The Rambam says, Achar kach mibim dam chilazon. This is the Rambam we saw already, but I brought it for you again in source 26. Now this is astonishing, right? Because what's Yam HaMelech called in English, guys? That's the Dead Sea. Why is it called the Dead Sea?
Nothing lives there.
Because nothing lives there. You can't live in the Dead Sea. That's why it's called the Dead Sea. So there's certain types of bacteria which are able to exist there. Yeah. They've probably been there for the past 2 billion years. But But, yeah, besides that, you can have a fish in the Dead Sea? No way. So, I would know two ways to interpret this. Number one, I would say that in the Dead Sea, it's matzui. When the Rambam says it's matzui b'Yam HaMelech, he doesn't mean in the Yam itself. It means around Yam HaMelech, and that would be another source than the Rambam, that it's actually terrestrial, as opposed to something aquatic. Or, Yam HaMelech maybe means, I'm being open-minded here, maybe Yam HaMelech actually means the Mediterranean. And that what we colloquially call the Yam HaMelech, maybe just means the salty sea, as opposed to the freshwater sea. It doesn't mean the Kinneret, it means the Mediterranean. I went out of my way, I brought you a Rambam in Hilchos Klayim, that seems to assume that Yam HaMelech is interchangeable with the Mediterranean. So I'm being open-minded. I'm not saying the Rambam, it could be, is also going like the Talmud Bavli, that the Chilazon is found in the Mediterranean. But like we saw already, it's not so clear if that's true. It's even the stance of the Talmud Bavli, that's the Talmud Bavli in one place, the Talmud Bavli in other places. It seems to imply that it's terrestrial, and the Sifri is explicit with terrestrial. So, question marks. Now, the list, I want to talk about one more aspect of question before we get into halachic ramifications of the information that we had. So we're going to have one more point. I'm open for questions, then we'll get into halacha. Point to this follows. It's clear that as we saw already, the Braisa says there's an Isser, the Braisa trapping a Chilazon on Shabbos. Now, I brought for you here from the notes of a person named Gavriel in Hilchos Shabbos. So I put my notes here, and here it discusses the ability of transgressing is someone able to transgress a prohibition of tzeidah on an animal which is very slow. Yeah? So, it's not so clear. There's something called Shmona Shratzim. Shmona Shratzim you can be chayiv for tzeidah on. And the question is really, what's the essence of trapping? The essence of trapping is that you take something which is free and you limit its freedom. So something which is able to move around, you limit its ability to move around. So that's trapping. But if you don't limit its ability to move around, so then it's not called trapping. So what if there's an animal which moves very, very, very slowly? Can you trap that? There's one of the Rishonim, the Piskei Rid, the Yishayim Shrani, the Piskei Rid holds there's no such concept, Bechlal, of Tzeidah, when it comes to something which moves slow. So if the Chilazon is the Mirach Trunculus cannot move on its own. It gets moved by water current. According to Piskei Rid, there's no way in the world to be over an Issa D'Oraisa trapping it on Shabbos. The Braisa says you're over an Issa D'Oraisa if you trap a Chilazon on Shabbos. So it must be that according to Piskei Rid, the Chilazon cannot be the Mirach Trunculus. Even the Piskim who are matner on something which is able to be trapped, that's only if in some way or form you limit its movement. They didn't talk bechlal about an animal which is stationary, that doesn't move on its own. So if this would be a Kiddush, maybe someone could say such a thing, but maybe the Mirach Trunculus itself is not called stationary because it gets pushed by something. It doesn't move on its own. I didn't limit its movement because it really has no movement. But it could move because of the external to it. So maybe even that limitation is also called limiting its movement. That would be a massive chiddush, but maybe that's true. But this kasha is a kasha which, from what I remember, Yisrael Reisman asked this question, and Rabbi Leibowitz sent this question to them an answer to. So even though Rabbi Leibowitz is a big proponent of the Mirach Trunculus Techelet, this question he admitted he didn't have an answer to go ahead and address this. At this point I'm going to pause. What did we do so far? We presented information, we presented sources. We used those sources to question how in the eyes of Chazal did we view what a Chilazon is, and we took that information and questioned how does that relate back to the reality of the Mirach Trunculus? Questions, comments, concerns at this point? Yeah.
So according to the Ra'avad, that he said it might be a plant.
Yeah.
Why would he say that if blood is dafka, and also if it seems like there are a lot of other sources that indicate that it's an animal.
Don't know. It's a good question. He says somewhere between plant and an animal. He does say that, right? So what exactly that looks like, I don't know. Could blood be in a sap? There's a liquid that comes out of it, it's punctured. I don't know. I don't know how he understood those sources. Yeah.
About the point about the sunlight.
Yeah.
I'm confused. Why would it be so problematic for them to exclude that? Because like back then, isn't the only way they'd be able to do this seemingly complicated process it could be in light? Like they didn't have like bulbs or anything to do it like indoors or anything.
I understand they didn't have windows on the side of a building.
Oh, so why would they have to write like it needs to be done in the building with a window?
No, they should write it has to be done outside. In Baruch Sermon's house are also windows, right? But the degree of light that you need in order for the UV exposure to change the chemical makeup of the Techelet was, it had to be in the sun.
But back then they only had that sort of light.
That's true, but I'm saying the sunlight inside of a building wouldn't suffice. It had to be sunlight outside where it's direct exposure to the light of the sun. If it had to be done, the process had to be performed outside, I don't want him to say that.
But right now, but if you do it inside, like nowadays, there's like light interfering.
I understand. If you do it nowadays, that doesn't take away from the UV light, the fact that there's other light here. You don't think people were ever inside before there's something called electricity? I'm not sure you asked. What?
Just on that point, sorry to cut in, but on that point, just the last three words of the Gemara quoted is the Kalinon Leib and the Udra. Udra is the wool.
Yeah.
The word Kalinon, so translated as burn or heat up.
Correct.
Is there any chance that Kalinon means to heat up in the sun?
It's hard to imagine. I'm
just saying, just be open-minded.
It means the pashtus is that it's that same process that you did before to do a te'ima. They told you take a sample just to make sure the dye was good. So now you throw the whole thing into the thing, and the same was masichin before. Now you do it to all of it.
But again, the word Kalina, could that be heat up in the sun?
Maybe. I would want the Rambam to say that also then in the process. Yeah, I can't take all the questions. I'm going to take a few more and then, yeah.
I used a little bit of Google. I found an outside source from Devar and Rabbah. It says in Devar and Rabbah, like it's talking about the clothing that the Israel wore. And just quote as Al Tikma Al Zu Hakilas Nazek Shiakel Mabusha that when it's talking about like Pilazon, it says when Pilazon grows, it's Mabusha grows with it.
Yeah, it's like the Shiur Shem Rabbah that we brought.
Yeah.
Yeah, correct. It implies like a snail. Oh, yeah? Yeah, I'm just saying that. I'm not saying this one source like that. I don't source like that. 100%. Yeah, okay.
Like this, it doesn't like say this explicitly, but like if it smells so bad, I would think that nobody would ever make it indoors.
So I told you it's anecdotal, but Mark Sturman's my proof not like that, right? He did it for decades. He was doing experiments in his house until his wife said, enough's enough. His wife had to kick him out. It took decades. I hear what you're saying. I could imagine someone saying such a smara, but if you're telling me a direction book. Goldstein, yeah.
Could it be the issue on Shabbos being like, let's say it is the Mir Extremicus and it looks like the seabed, like sticking out the Mir Extremicus from the seabed? Like, wouldn't that be an issue?
The question is, how do you trap it? It's something, it's nitzul va'omid, it's already trapped. Trapping means I limit its ability to be free. I didn't limit its ability to be free because it was stagnant as it was. That's the difficulty with Seder. Yeah, Emmy, last question for now. We'll come back to other questions.
Is it a problem that had to add chemicals or something?
No, it's explicit in the Gemara and in the Rambam that they have chemicals also. Every time it was like that. So I'm going to have another period for the questions. I just want to make sure that we have time for the halacha. So now what do I do with this, right? What do I do with this? So when I asked the Hershel Schechter this question, I asked him 3 questions. Yeah. So one of them he said was dependent on Rambam and Tosfos, and the other 2 he didn't have an answer for. So now he said at least it's a suffix d'oraisa l'chumra. That was his response to me. So now I want to question: is that true? Is it true that this is a case of suffix d'oraisa l'chumra? That due to the suffix you now have to be machmer and put on Techelet, because if you're not machmer and put on Techelet, maybe you're not fulfilling a mitzvah d'oraisa which you're able to fulfill. That's a bad thing. We like to do mitzvahs. Not to do a mitzvah, a bittul mitzvah essay, right? We wouldn't want to do that. So, there was a person named the Redziner. The Redziner found Techelet 150 years ago. His Techelet came from a squid. And he went all around Europe trying to sell his Techelet to different Rabbanim. He went to 2 different Rabbanim from 2 totally different opposite sides of the Jewish spectrum, and they both gave him the same answer. One of them was the Rogachover. He was related to Chabad in some way, no? He lived in a place called Dvinsk. He was a Rav at the same time in Dvinsk as the Or Sameach, the Meir Simcha. That was one person he went to. The other person he went to was Reb Chaim Brisker, Reb Chaim Soloveitchik. Both of them told him that Safek Deraisa the Chumrah does not apply in a case where after you perform the mitzvah, you still don't know whether or not the mitzvah was accomplished. For example, just to clarify things. Let's say I have a Safek whether I made Birkas Hamazon. I had a Friday night Suda, I'm stuffed to the brim, I have a Chiyuv Deraisa to bench. Now I have a Safek whether I benched or not. Do I have to bench again? The answer is, we say Safek Deraisa l'chumra, benching is a mitzvah deraisa. If you have a Safek whether or not you benched, you have to bench again. Now, after I bench the second time, do I know for sure that I fulfilled the mitzvah deraisa? Absolutely, I benched. I just benched. I had the bencher out this time, I said it out loud with the niggin, the whole kid and caboodle, right? Beautiful. So now, Safek Deraisa l'chumra had me at the end of the day knowing that I fulfilled the mitzvah. Said Reb Chaim, said the Rogachover, if I put these tzitzis on, I have no idea whether or not I fulfilled the mitzvah or not. And since I have no idea whether or not I fulfilled the mitzvah, so then, if that's the case, Safek Deraisa l'chumra doesn't tell me I have to do anything. That was the response. And therefore they didn't put on the Techelet. Now, comes along Hershel Shechter and Raya Dibowitz. I don't know, I assume, I don't know who had it first, they're there, I don't know. So, they both ask a question. There's a Ran. The Ran, which is Paskin in the Mishnah Brura. The Ran says, on the first day of Sukkot, there's a mitzvah, the Orayta of taking lulav. Right? L'kachtem lechem bayim harishon, prei sadol kapas kmorim. Right? That's the Orayta. What happened the first day? You forgot about it. You were sick. You were dehydrated because you were on a desert retreat and all this. You wake up and you didn't take lulav. Right? So now what do? So, go run and take lulav. What happens already though if it's bein hashmashos? Bein hashmashos, it's already maybe the second day, maybe it's still the first day, it's a time of Safek. Do I have to go ahead now and take lulav still? Says the Ran, which is Paskin the Mishnah Brura, absolutely. Why? Because Safek Deraisa l'chumra. So here we have a case where there's a Safek Deraisa l'chumra that's brought both in the Ran and Paskin the Halacha, that in the case of a Safek Deraisa, even though you'll never know whether or not you fulfill the mitzvah until after 120, right? Because it's been a shmashos, we don't know what the din is. Nonetheless, you have an obligation to do it. So they said, we see from there that what Reb Chaim said and the Rogachover said is not true. And therefore, the Safek Deraisa l'chumra obligates you even in a place where where you don't know whether or not at the end of the day you fulfill the mitzvah. I think there's not a proof at all. Number one, it's pashut. If anyone ever learned anything that the Rogachover wrote, or anything they understood who Reb Chaim was, the way I said that is precise. If you saw anything the Rogachover wrote, or if you understood who Reb Chaim was, you would know that they wouldn't miss a ran. The pasha ran in Lulav Gazel. I knew the Ran in Lulav Gazel. I'm saying Reb Chaim, the Rogachover, they knew the Ran in Lulav Gazel. And nonetheless they said it. That's number one. Number two, the two cases have absolutely nothing to do with each other. They're different from Hodu and Kush. Mamish, two totally separate ideas. Why? Because when it comes to Lulav on the first day, everyone knows that there's a mitzvah deraisa Lulav. Everyone knows exactly what that mitzvah is. They know exactly what it looks like. There's no doubt whatsoever. There's one question. Is this the proper time? Is it still the first day of Sukkot or not? That Safek Deraisa l'chumra tells you, when you know exactly what the mitzvah is, you know exactly what you're supposed to do, you know there's a tzivui, you know there's a commandment. You just don't know if on the day, the time of doing it, so then do the mitzvah. Good. Safek Deraisa l'chumra can tell me that. Can Safek Deraisa l'chumra tell me that you don't know if something bichlal is the act of a mitzvah? I don't know if this action is a mitzvah whatsoever. And now, because maybe there's a way to interpret information that it could be a mitzvah, that defines it as a mitzvah? Where do you see that precedent? How do you know that? How does that generated a concept? You don't see that from the Ran. The Ran never discussed such a case. The Ran discussed a case where I don't know if something's a mitzvah or not, so it told me to do it anyway, because maybe it's a mitzvah. You don't see that in the Ran. You see in the Ran that something we know is a mitzvah already, we're just not sure if this is the time period we're able to perform it, do it still. to establish a mitzvah based off the concept of Safek D'Oraisa L'Chumra, because maybe it's a mitzvah, maybe not? There's no such Ran. There's no such Shulchan Aruch. I asked this question to Rav Hershel Shechter. He didn't have an answer to that question. So, Safek D'Oraisa L'Chumra, I don't think there is. Now, if that's the case, what happened to Bal Tigra? Bal Tigra, maybe you're doing this is D'Oraisa by not wearing Tcheles. So now, that again, Bal Tigra, I brought for you here Rambam and Hilchos Mamrim. But first I brought you Shut Beis Halevi. Shut Beis Halevi says explicitly that if we had Tcheles and you didn't wear Tcheles, you're over on Bal Tigra. So it's clear, it's explicit in Halacha. There are people that disagree with this Beis Halevi. And the Beis Halevi writes explicitly that a person who doesn't wear Tcheles and they could wear Tcheles is over on Bal Tigra. It's not a crazy thing. It's not a crazy statement to say. Why do I not think you're over on Bal Tigra? Because that's talking in a case where you have Vadei Tcheles. According to the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim, we don't have time to read it inside. According to the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim, when you take a mitzvah, that's a mitzvah that you're obligated in, and you're okered, you uproot that mitzvah and say that mitzvah I don't have to do anymore, that's Bal Tigra. If I have a mitzvah, which there's a suffix whether Bechlal it's a mitzvah or not, if I don't perform that, that's not called Bal Tigra. Obviously, I'm not oker anything, because I'm not a chiv to do it yet. If there was a suffix D'Oraisa L'Chumra, maybe we could talk. Maybe it's still only a suffix. If it was a vadei mitzvah, fine. That's what the machlokes in the poskim. The Beis Halevi says yes, other Chanim say not. But to take something which is not even a suffix D'Oraisa L'Chumra, right? I'm just explaining the Chaim and the Rogat. Something is not a suffix D'Oraisa L'Chumra, and to say that you're not Bal Tigra on that's an impossibility. There's no Akira's mitzvah. The Bal Tigra demands that there's an Akira of the mitzvah itself. Here there's no Akira of the mitzvah itself. So therefore, I would say, my conclusion is as follows. What the Chilazon is a mystery. In Chazal, I have no idea. There's things that show it's blue, it's terrestrial, it's right? That we make it, that the Techelet from its blood, not as a gland, right? And we have things that support that maybe the Mirach Trunculus is. So could it be, could it not be? If I was looking purely at Chazal, my assumption would be not. So now, there's something called science, and I look at the world, and I see, wow, there's something called a business that was done on the Mediterranean with these types of snails, and in Greek they called it kulpa, and all the different proofs that they have in archaeology. So now, what do I do with that? How am I supposed to relate to that? That's a great question. That's a wonderful question. And I'm not coming to answer that question. Each person, based off who you are, you have to be able to swallow that pill. Rav Asher Weiss writes that maybe those snails were used to make argamon. Argamon was purple. In a certain way, that makes sense, right? If you have a snail, which it creates a purple dye unless it's out in the sun, maybe it made argamon. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe it made Techelet. I'm not saying not. But, number one, if someone tells you something, you come, you have to wear Techelet. You have, this is it. If you don't do it, you're about Tigra. All these questions, right? Look into it. What's Halacha say? What does Chazal say? Now there's a tension here between science and Chazal. How do I deal with that? How do I grapple with that? These are all good questions. Now, what are the halachic ramifications of this? Those are also very good questions. But just to give you an idea that how to take something which is a scientific reality and to go ahead and balance that, to challenge that from halakha. And halakha view this the same way science does. And now, practically, in a practical sense, what's that mean in a halakhic sense? How do I go ahead and embrace that? Yeah. Questions?
Just going back to source like 2022, how the Yad Ramah that the Chilazon we're talking about here is different than what we're talking about in Malchus, was it?
Correct.
You said, and then you said you asked Rav Shechter this question.
No, I asked Rav Shechter how to learn how he understood the Gemara in Sanhedrin. The fact that the mountain was full of Chilazon, and he didn't understand how that fit with the Mirach Trunculus.
And he couldn't say...
He didn't quote the Yad Ramah, correct. He didn't quote the Yad Ramah. Now, does the Yad Ramah answer? The Yad Ramah is an answer. Rashi says not like that. If you were going to ask me which one of the Rishonim is more authoritative, the Yad Ramah or Rashi, I would assume that Rashi is more authoritative. Maybe that's why he didn't say that. I don't know. Yeah. You did, yeah?
Yeah. Let's say that someone believes that Techelet isn't a thing, hypothetically. But then let's say
70% of Am Yisrael takes, wears Techelet, where does Minhag Klali Yisrael play into this whole?
It's a very good question. I don't know answer that question. I don't know. I would assume as follows also. Guys, I would say even more. Let's say the boys have asked me, you know what, I used to wear Techelet, should I take my Techelet off? I don't think it's true anymore. I've told them no, don't take it off. Why would I tell them not to take it off? It's very simple. When you learn the Sugi in Menachos, it's not so clear that the only thing that's able to make Techelet from is Chilazon. Chazal made Techelet from a Chilazon. It could be that anything which is able to produce a blue dye, which is a living item, and fits certain details, so its parameters also is a viable means of making Techelet. So even if the Mir Chunkulus is not the Techelet of Chazal, maybe that's also a legitimate means of establishing the blue. So I never told Chas Hashem to tell them to take it off. The Big Rabban never told people to take it off. I saw my own eyes. There's a story which, if you want to hear, I'll tell you afterwards. I'm not being filmed. That there's a certain gadol who someone came to ask a totally different question. He told him to take off his tzitzis, because they had tchelas on it. You'd be surprised which gadol it was. Yeah. Shalom.
Shlomo shared an idea that maybe a different fish called the antenna that fits more of these things that would
Maybe. Listen, I'm open-minded. Maybe it's a horseshoe crab. I'm also open-minded to that. It also has a shell, and it also grows with it, and also goes into the land, and also is in the sea, and its blood is blue. And I'm open-minded. It could be. I don't know.
So follow up is that you hear all these different things. What you just said about maybe they made it with all these different types of dye. So then, how does that work? Different people could have. Someone could have 18 or 20.
Yeah. So I would just say as follows, guys. When it comes to things like this, my personal approach would be that when I try to live a halachic life, I try to live the parameters which halacha demands from me. So if I look at a sugya and it's a suffix, whether or not I have to do something, and here a suffix d'oraisa v'chumra does not apply, that means the Torah is not telling me to put this on. So I personally, the Torah is not telling me to put it on. So I don't live a life of maybe maybe not, and it's good, am I not? And I want to do what the Torah tells me. If the Torah is not telling me to do it, I don't want to do it. If the Torah tells me to do it, I'm going to run for it. So because there are potential ways to explain things doesn't mean that that's something which I should actively go ahead and make an effort to try to go and accomplish. That's a personal opinion. There could be that people feel differently in that, but that would be my approach. Yeah, last question, Micha, just because Rabbi is at 12.
What is the issue with the Zohar? Because the Zohar says, it doesn't actually mention the Chilazon, it just mentions Techelet. And I'm thinking that maybe when it says that by Ginasar there, the Techelet comes from there, it could be a process of dyeing there, or a process of shipping there, and not necessarily finding the Chilazon.
It says Techelet is Mihahu Nuna, it's from that fish. The Yama de Ginosar, from the Yama Ginosar to the Kinneret. So I assume it's talking about where the fish comes from. That's where I assume it's coming from. Guys, I'm happy to have this discussion further. I'm not going anywhere. But I don't know. But the point of this is, just don't hear a shiur about halacha and then make decisions. If you hear something, it sounds so good, it seems like it can't be any other way. So then ask questions. Why? How can people disagree? There are other people that don't do this. Be inquisitive. Take information and search for it. Search for a truth. Search for something. What's the Torah saying? How am I supposed to interpret this? How am I supposed to relate to that? How come he disagrees? And when you go and approach Torah like that, then you'll come to your own emes. That's the, if anything, that's the overarching goal of what I'm trying to give over to today. And with that, you should have a good Shabbos and a good day.